As many analysts have explained, the École Polytechnique and the affiliated schools of application, or application schools, became a top tier not only of technical education, but of higher education in general. In contrast with for example, with Germany, universities emerge at a lower rank in France. For while they serve as sites for accessing the laws of nature and even for training future bureaucrats in law so that they too can apply reason in a rational government, it's the graduates of these engineering schools that became the ones who directly embody and evidence the rationalization of the state itself, and hence of society. The high prestige earned for them all this collection of schools the official title of Grandes Ecoles, the grand schools. The state engineers thus functioned at the top of French society through the state corps, or technical departments, playing central roles in French technological development. As Kranakis explains, for example, quote, anyone who wanted to build or use a stationary steam engine in France had to get prior permission from the École des Mines, from the Corps des Mines. And until 1865, had to follow detailed design and safety standards established by the engineers of this corps. Engineers of the Corps des Mines also inspected, regulated, and kept track of mining and metallurgical establishments throughout the country. Engineers of the Corps des Ponts et Chaussées, the Bridges and Roads Department, did the same for railroads, bridges, canals, and ports. And indeed, they designed and oversaw the building of many of these structures. End quote. So can you see the authority vested in these technical departments in the administrative bureaucracy of the executive branch of the state? The curricula at these schools exemplified the priority that was given to mathematical theory, with practical work understood as the application of science, applied science, working its way all the way down ultimately to hands-on craft knowledge. Early on, the École Polytechnique focused exclusively on mathematics, theoretical mechanics, and descriptive geometry. A visiting American scientist, for example, in 1837, reported that for the first-year students, 70% of their lessons were devoted to mathematics and theoretical mechanics. The only course that had any experimental or lab work at all was chemistry, and it basically constituted only 1/6 of the curriculum and was a lower value activity. The method for ranking students, for example, placed greatest weight on knowledge of mathematics and least on knowledge of physics or chemistry. I mean, even a student's conduct was weighted more heavily than his knowledge of physics and chemistry. In the 1860s, 1869, an American educator visited the École Polytechnique and reported that the curriculum was essentially that had been outlined by the other visitor earlier in 1837. This later visitor, as Kranakis explains, pointed out that there was indeed an ongoing dispute between the exclusive study of abstract mathematics and an early introduction to practical experience, but he expected no change because, as he put it, quote, the traditional teaching of the school will be too strong for legislative interference, and that, in spite of recent enactments, abstract science and analysis will reign in the lecture rooms and halls of the study of the Polytechnic. End quote. Now, at first glance, the application schools, the schools of application, were more involved in the immediate needs and details of technological practice. But the theoretical priority and the emphasis on theory was still plain. Students at the School of Bridges and Roads took lecture courses in mechanics, in something called stereotomy, as it was applied to construction, in drawing and in architecture. Other coursework included construction, a little more practical, more oriented to actual work, mineralogy, geology, administrative law and foreign languages. The applied mechanics course included hydraulics and hydrodynamics. And by the late 19th century, students at these schools were studying applied mechanics, mineralogy, geology, political economy, agriculture, roads, and construction, while second and third year students had more specialized courses covering such topics as bridges, steam engines, railroads, maritime construction, architecture, and administrative law. Third year students had drawing as well. At the School of Mines, the curriculum basically covered four main subjects: mines and machines, metallurgy, assaying, and geology and mineralogy. In the mid-19th century, courses were added in railroads and construction, topography, and industrial economics and legislation. After the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, a course in artillery was added. And in the late 1880s, courses in industrial chemistry and in factory organization were established. In other words, these schools basically organized around a hierarchy that privileged mathematics, but also included the application of mathematics, the applied sciences, for the purpose of enacting actual technological developments. Training at both the School of Bridges and Roads and the School of Mines did include some field work and some lab work. But what became institutionalized, both at the École Polytechnique and in these other schools, was a system that placed mathematics first and involved a search for the underlying principles in any situation of practice. As the historian Jan Sebestik puts it, quote, "Technological training in France was conceived as the transfer of fundamental general knowledge to a particular field of production. According to this concept, the specific nature of technological knowledge and activity was overshadowed by the idea of a mixture of elements of knowledge derived from various theoretical sciences." In other words, the theoretical sciences are primary. "The relationship between pure and applied science was a one-way street." End quote. The relationship between pure and applied was a one-way street. This is the point. Incidentally, this contrasted sharply with the later German technological science, which was working upward from practical reason rather than downward from mathematical theory. The polytechnicians had a highly structured routine. But in contrast with other lower ranked schools, as we'll see, they were not treated as prisoners of their school. As Kranakis explains, quote, these students, they got up at 6 a.m. and they put in 11.5 hours per day. But 5.5 of those hours were classified as free study. They got Wednesday afternoon off as well as Sunday, and they could leave the school on their own during those times. End quote. Also, these students were not expected to clean their own quarters. Now think about this. The American visitor who arrived in 1837 had reported, quote, "The pupils do not perform any duties of police. Their arms are cleaned and kept by an armorer, and barrack keepers are appointed for the police of the quarters, provisions which I look upon as defects." This is an American talking. End quote. So the point here is that it was beneath the dignity of a polytechnician to make his own bed, or to clean his gun or his sword. Not surprisingly, the elite schools were drawing from the upper classes, the upper echelons of society. Only the educated could demonstrate merit. Entrance or promotion into the school depended upon an examination so difficult that the preparatory training required a year or two past secondary school in order to be ready. This process actually became a national competition. According to Kranakis, quote, "The national competition lasted several weeks and included written and oral examinations, as well as athletic trials. The written part of the examination occupied approximately 24 hours, distributed over 4 days. To do well, candidates had to have a thorough mastery of algebra, geometry, and trigonometry, a grounding in mechanics, physics, and chemistry, and knowledge of a foreign language." End quote. As Kranakis further explains, throughout the 19th century, Although the popular classes, including artisans, peasants, shopkeepers, constituted roughly 90% of the population, the proportion of polytechnicians from these classes never exceeded 4%. Rather, roughly 60 or 70% came from the highest levels of society, including the families of large landowners, high-ranking officers, administrators, industrialists, wealthy merchants, and members of the liberal professions. The recruitment pool for the application schools was somewhat broader, but only slightly, with more than 50% coming from the families of large landowners and the high-ranking administrators, the wealthy bankers, industrialists, and the like, and fewer than 7% coming from the popular classes.